Thank you so much for coming. It feels great to see everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alexandra Vacru. I'm currently Vice President for Strategic Engagement at the Kyiv School of Economics. Also was the Executive Director of the Davis Center for 15 years. And so therefore know and love many of you. The ones I don't love are the ones I don't know, needless to say. And I want to introduce my colleague, or I'll allow him to introduce himself. This is Dr. Timothy Brick.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We still have to work on smooth
introduction.
My name is Timothy Brick. I am from Kyiv. I'm a sociologist by training, and I joined Kyiv School of Economics 6 or 7 years ago, and eventually I became a rector of this university, which is equivalent to provost. Our university works in coordination with other entities like think tank, charitable foundation, business school, and all together under the umbrella of Kyiv School of Economics, we work on launching new educational programs, research, and it ranges from social science to engineering, from policy advice to advocacy. So we do quite a lot. This is my first time here in Davis, so thank you so much for inviting us. And together with Alexandra, we'll give you some updates about what's happening in Ukraine. My role today is to talk as a sociologist, to give you some insight about Ukrainian society and to answer to your questions. Thank you.
So, and I'm going to do more of the overview of the situation on the ground now. It will be less analytical and kind of more descriptive of what we're seeing. The problem with having a title called Ukraine, What's Next these days is that every day you wake up and you realize you have to completely change your slides. So there might be a few bumpy spots on the slides, but I also have a lot of backup slides if you have questions about things that aren't directly addressed in our presentation. And I even have some backup slides on social issues as well. So we're really here to answer any of the questions you have on Ukraine. What's that?
I can leave.
Yeah. You can't leave, but you can. Yeah. All right. So first, I'm sure most of you are familiar with what's happening on the ground. But just to recap, this is the line of contact right now in the conflict. It's about 700 miles long, 1,000 kilometers long. So the distance between Paris and Budapest. And I would say that one of the reasons this is important to think about is when we talk about a peacekeeping force, right? You think, how many soldiers would it take to have a peacekeeping force along 1,000-kilometer front line, right? That is a lot of people that you're talking about. And that is very important in the different discussions of a ceasefire. The map, as you know, these are the areas, Crimea and the Donbass, that Russia first occupied in 2014. So when Ukrainians talk about the war, they talk about it starting in 2014, and then the full-scale invasion is what started in February of 22, 3 years ago. The other reason I like this map, or I use this map, is because the line of contact is here, but the edge of Kherson Oblast, the state of Kherson, is actually still very much in Ukrainian territory. And this is true in Zaporizhia also. It's true to some extent in Donetsk and also in Luhansk. Well, less in Luhansk. But what this means is that even though Russia claims these 4 regions as territory it occupies and has officially annexed those 4 territories in its constitution, it does not actually control all of that territory. So Russia is asking for territory that it has, in some cases, never physically controlled. This area of Ukraine represents just under 20% of Ukrainian territory. It also represents millions of people. And so the other question that the Ukrainians are constantly bringing up when we talk about a ceasefire is, okay, occupied territory is one thing, but what about all of those people that are in occupied territories? It's also about 5 or 6 million people, if you exclude Crimea. 5 or 6 million people, probably most of whom would rather not be in occupied territory, even though they've been forced to take Russian passports. And one of the very complicated issues in a ceasefire is going to be like, okay, ceasefire, does that mean that anybody who wants to leave those territories can come back to Ukraine or not? And for Ukrainians, it's not just land, right? It's people. And we can't give up those people without recognizing what we're doing and speaking it out loud. Now, the front line is where most of the battles and the attacks are happening. But as I'm sure you're aware, Ukraine is actually striking, or Ukraine is being hit completely across the country, in Lviv, in the west, in Kiev, in the north, in Sumy, in Kharkiv, all of these areas here are being hit constantly by drone attacks and missiles. So if we look here at the daily tally of missile attacks, we see launched versus destroyed. But what's important here is the trend line, right? As Russia has felt that it has an advantage, at least in terms of time and numbers of men, it has increased the aerial attacks that it's launching. And that includes not only drones, the Shahed drones, which, by the way, I mean, you can't tell when you see the pictures, they're 2 meters wide and have either bombs on the end or they're decoys meant to distract the air defense systems. And then you have, of course, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. So living in Kiev, as we do, you'll have an air alert, usually every night, like it's kind of on schedule, not Friday nights, but most of the other nights. And then you can look on Telegram channels and see, okay, what's flying? There's a channel called Sholitit, right? So you see like, okay, drones. If there were a drone flying over Boston, what are the odds that it's going to fly, into the Davis Center? Not so high. You continue with your life. But if you have a ballistic missile attack, you think, okay, like maybe it's better to go into the shelter, right? And you have 6 or 7 minutes to get into the shelter between the time a ballistic missile is launched and when it would likely hit. The missiles are actually getting through. So right now there are Patriot missile defense systems, some European missile defense systems. They don't stop everything. This was an attack in Bucha last week, right? Things get set on fire all the time. Usually the targets are infrastructure, energy infrastructure, military targets, which can include training grounds, but also factories that might be producing drones or where there are rumors of having a lot of soldiers accumulated. And it's quite important to realize that even though missile defense is reassuring, it doesn't really catch more than half of the missiles in question. So even now, things are falling on people, right? Especially in Kharkiv and in Sumy and in those communities along the front line. We don't know exactly the number of Ukrainians that have been killed. It's not publicly announced. It's going to be over 100,000 killed and wounded. Now, this is still much less than what we think the numbers are for Russia. The estimate of casualties, which again is killed and wounded, is probably closer to 1 million people. But you see in many places monuments to those who have been killed. These are flags just in the center of Kiev on the Maidan. You can see the I Love Ukraine sign in the back there. And 80% of Ukrainians had said last year that they knew at least one person who had been killed in the war, either someone very close to them, a friend, or a family member. So that is a lot of impact all across the population. So when you say, it's the Ukrainians who don't want peace, like you really have to ask why that would possibly be the case. Like no one wants the war to stop more than the Ukrainians, but they want the war to stop and not start again. And I'll talk about ceasefires in a second. So this was the Oval Office meeting that went so badly. There are all sorts of debates over what was happening here. Was it an ambush? Was the point to make Zelensky look bad? In a way, it doesn't really matter, right? Zelensky was here because he wanted to come and sign a deal. And again, the deal, people are saying it's very colonial. The United States is, very mercenary, wants Ukraine to pay back the aid that was given as a grant. That also, in a way, doesn't really matter, right? For one thing, the agreement here, just like the agreements that are being discussed with Mexico or with China, are performative. So you're talking about raw materials in the ground. Probably takes 10 years to get them out of the ground. You need an enormous amount of investment. Nobody's dying to invest right now in those facilities. So you think, okay, by the time we're talking about revenue from those rare earths, like Trump probably won't be in power, Zelensky won't be in power. Those commitments in theory are not so complicated to make, right? But what's important here is that if the US is trying to pressure Zelensky into a deal, there are serious implications for Ukrainian security. Before I talk about what those are, let me talk again about the ceasefire, right? Trump has said, I just want to make this deal, right? Making the deal is complicated. Enforcing it afterwards is tricky. And the Ukrainians who have experience of deals that have not been enforced, whether it's Budapest Memorandum in 1994 or the Minsk agreements, like they don't believe that Russia saying it's going to stop shooting means Russia is going to stop shooting. So when Trump's people say, this is so easy, let's just sign a piece of paper, the Ukrainians are like, paper is worth nothing, right? And it's not just this deal that's difficult, right? We can look at Gaza, where the ceasefires are falling apart all the time, right? Because it's actually enforcement that matters. But even if we go back to the Korean War, in order to negotiate the end of the Korean War, which lasted 3 years, there were 2 years of negotiations. The last 2 years were happening during negotiations, 158 meetings of the negotiators, and the violence and the killing and the deaths were never as acute as in those 2 years when the negotiations were happening, because both sides were trying to get an advantage on the ground in terms of setting the line of contact. This is, as you can see, like the first year of meetings, these are the negotiations. So this idea, like, snap our fingers and like the Ukrainians and the Russians are going to sign something, it's totally delusional. It's totally delusional. And the thing that's not really being talked about is that you can probably get the Ukrainians, you can probably force the Ukrainians to sign something, but I fail to see how they're going to get Putin to sign something, because it is not in his interest to stop the fighting right now. The Russians think they have an advantage on the ground. There's debate about that. The Russians think they can continue mobilizing more people than the Ukrainians. That's true. The Ukrainians have some very difficult decisions to make. And so from Putin's point of view, as has been true for quite a long time, time is on his side. He can just keep fighting. So why would he want to sign a ceasefire, right? The ceasefire only helps Ukraine at this point. And that's a side of the negotiation that, to my mind, the Trump administration has not even addressed yet. They think getting Zelensky to the table is hard. Like, wait till they try and get Putin to the table. So in the meantime, because of that blow up in the Oval Office, which actually might not have anything to do with the decision to cut aid. There are some people who say the decision was taken the week before, and then that blow up in the White House was used as a pretext for cutting off of aid. So the United States froze all military supplies. So that includes our Patriot missile systems. Ukraine right now has 5 of them. Most of them are defending Kyiv and Kharkiv. 5 is not a lot of Patriot systems, by the way. There are a lot of other countries in Europe that have more of them and are talking about donating them. But the real problem is that you need to put missiles in the Patriot system, and those missiles cost $3 million each. And so when the Russians are launching the drone attacks, what they're doing is mixing up real drones, decoy drones, and missiles so that the Ukrainians will spend $3 million on a Patriot missile and then eventually run out. And the Americans know this. So they say, like, if we stop giving you those Patriot missiles, at some point, you're not going to be able to stop even 50% of the ballistics that are coming into Kyiv. And then you have a lot more pressure on the population. There are other European air defense systems, but they're not as effective as the Patriots. So that means that this was yesterday's attack. So 67 ballistic missiles, 194 drones. This is in Kharkiv. They make a mark. And you think, what if all of those actually fell onto the ground in Ukraine? Like, that is going to be a significant deterioration of the quality of life in Ukraine, which is already fraught, especially along those front line regions. And again, of course, the Russians know that. So if we look at the type of attacks that they've been making, we have seen that the number of drone attacks has significantly increased as the Russians have started producing them themselves. The Iranians licensed the Shaheeds to the Russians, who now produce the Gerand drone systems. But you have had a reduction in the number of ballistic missiles because the Russians seem to be running out, even though the Koreans, the North Koreans are providing some of them, and because some of the sanctions that limit chips and electronics are working enough so that the Russians cannot produce all the ballistic missiles that they would like to produce. But again, with a little more time, like let's say they had an extra year, they could probably find ways to get some of that equipment there and produce more of the missiles. So Patriot missiles, those are very important, and the Ukrainians are particularly sensitive about those. The other thing that's being cut off are related to HIMARS. So HIMARS, they look a little bit like the Patriots, but they're offensive, and they're what's being used to send Ukrainian missiles and drones into Russia. So Ukraine has started to attack different energy infrastructure in Russia They're not attacking civilians, although there have been some civilians that have been hurt, but they are targeting oil refineries and oil production facilities in an effort to reduce the amount of income that the Russians are able to earn from selling oil and gas. And HIMARS are very important. They're important not only because they have the capability to launch further into Russia, but also because the satellite information that the Americans have been providing allow the Ukrainians to know exactly where there are either Russian troop concentrations or the exact coordinates of the oil and gas facilities. This is Maxar technology. This is Snake Island. And this is something that was posted on the internet today, which basically says that Maxar has cut off satellite access to the Ukrainians. So the Trump administration, I didn't mean to say Russians, have not only cut off military equipment, but they've also told the Americans and the Brits that they're no longer able to share intelligence with the Ukrainians. And this is important, not only because these are the maps that everyone uses, journalists and the Ukrainians for targeting, but also because that is the information that tells the Ukrainians when ballistic missiles are launched, for example. Or we'll get an air alert that says that MiG planes are in the air. We know that they carry missiles and glide bombs, including the supersonic ones. And so there'll be an alert across all of Ukraine saying, get in the shelter, the MiGs have started flying. That is all based on American intelligence, which is no longer being provided. So that is a very serious problem. Oh, sorry. So this is just where the Ukrainians have managed to strike in Russia using either HIMARS or drones. And you can see the yellow there is an oil base and like oil production, and the blue one is a refinery of some kind. So they've been pretty effective in terms of the attack. Now, what has that meant for Russia? So if we look at how much Russia is earning from fossil fuels, something that's quite shocking, sorry, Marcus can't see here, is that if you look when the war started and oil prices went up, Russia was earning over $1 billion a day from the sale of oil and gas, most of which was going to Europe. The Europeans impose a price cap here, first on oil and then on oil products, and that pushes Russian revenues down. However, Russia is still earning about $500 million a day on the sale of oil and gas products. That's mostly from China and India, and to some extent Turkey, and the fact that the Europeans are buying natural gas now, because that wasn't banned. But that amount of money is more than what they're spending in Ukraine on any given day. So as long as they still get money from oil and gas sales, they still have enough money to keep fighting. And this idea that the economy is under pressure, it's going to crack sooner or later, there's debt piling up, all of that is true. But I don't think there's anything you can do economically that will pressure Russia into stopping the war, because they can always move money from the welfare state, from benefits, from hospitals, from paving roads, from education. Like, they will find the money that they need, in part because they can keep earning it, and in part because they're willing to divert funds from other resources. The other important factor that might affect Ukraine is Starlink. So Starlink is not government provided, as you know, it's Elon Musk's company. The government is paying for the Ukrainians to have access. So it's not like Elon Musk is doing this out of the goodness of his heart, if he has one. But this is also extremely important in terms of communications between the different Ukrainian brigades and military command and people on the ground. Starlink is what's used also for drones, in order to be directing drones to the right location. Now, there's been a greater shift towards fiber optic drones. So I didn't really understand how this worked until you see the picture. There are drones that are flying basically with tails of cables behind them because they can't be jammed from the ground electronically. So those can still fly, but you need to know where you're sending that drone. And that to some extent depends on Starlink. So right now, the Ukrainians have been cut off from using Starlink. One of the questions that they're asking themselves is, is Musk going to be providing Starlink to the Russians, right? Because that would be devastating. We haven't seen it yet, but like that is one of the big questions. Okay, terrible meeting in the Oval Office. All of this stuff is being cut off. So what do the Europeans do? they rush to London, they have a meeting, and they think, okay, like now it's getting real, we have to do something. And so one of the questions we ask ourselves is, like, are the Europeans actually able to step in and replace what the Americans have been providing? So let's look at the aid sent to Ukraine. Right, it's very hard to kind of visualize it, but this is pretty good. So it uses the Kyiv Institute data, which is the main data we have on military and non-military aid being provided to Ukraine. And what you see here in red is the military aid from the US and from the EU. They're roughly similar, let's say. And then you have additional European countries that provide aid. However, even the European money that's here involves some purchases of American equipment, right? So it's not like Europe is only giving European systems to Ukraine. In many cases, they're giving American systems. And there are whole other discussions, probably Dima knows better than I, about what is coming from stockpiles and what is coming from production. But for the most part, what you need to know here is that while the US is not super dominant in terms of the value of the military aid, the fact that the technology is mostly American is what matters here. And right now in Ukraine, about 40% of the military equipment is American, 20% is European, I mean the actual technology. 20% is European, 20% is American, and the rest is Ukrainian made. And the proportion that's Ukrainian made, particularly in terms of drones, is rising pretty quickly. In fact, I think most of the students at the Kyiv School of Economics have a drone startup with drones that are doing different things. You can also see in terms of non-military aid, financial aid, here the Europeans are much more significant than the Americans. And this is also no joke, right? Because it means that the Ukrainians are able to pay their teachers, are able to pay their doctors. All of the taxes that are collected in Ukraine go to the military. And so the financial aid that's coming from other countries is going to basically pay for the rest of the budget. Europe can step in and provide some aid to Ukraine, but it comes at a cost, right? There's opportunity cost in everything. And one of the problems is that if we look at the percentage of defense spending, with 2%, which was the previous NATO target, most of the countries have not been spending that much. Poland kind of saw where things were going and has greatly increased its spending. So have the Baltic countries. But if Europe has to be on a war footing, and I don't know if you saw, but Macron and someone else came out today and basically said, you know, it's time to go on a war footing. You probably need these countries to be spending 4 or 5% of their GDP. And that means that they're going to have to cut back on the welfare state, which also means that the far-right forces that have been gaining power in Europe are going to become more competitive because people are going to be unhappy that their welfare benefits are being reduced. So Europe has a big problem. It might want to help Ukraine, but it's going to be quite difficult to do it, both from the technology perspective and from the point of view of where they get the funding that would be required to replace the American money, to say nothing of the fact that they can't replace the satellites, for example. So it's a very tricky question. I think that finally Europe is realizing that they will have to do something. Ukraine is realizing that it will have to do more, but neither of those factors taken together are going to be as powerful as what Ukraine was able to do with US aid. And that means we're going to be continuing more or less in this conflict, I think, for quite a long time. So over to you, Timothy.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Well, I don't have such beautiful slides. I mostly want to talk about Ukrainian society and to give you some understanding, kind of zoom out understanding of the society and how it functions. And, you know, besides being a rector, I also work as a researcher, and all researchers are motivated by addressing some puzzles or gaps. And one of the biggest gap today in Ukrainian studies is that there are kind of two common wisdoms. And the question is how to reconcile them because they state something very different from each other. So one common wisdom is that for many years of research, we've known that Ukraine is kind of ill-functioning society. You know, a lot of corruption, struggling democracy, low trust to formal institutions. And this is one wisdom, common knowledge. But there is another common knowledge. We also know that Ukrainian society is highly mobilized, that during this invasion, society mobilized around the president, around the idea of national sovereignty, and, you know, the volunteer movement has increased. So the question is, which is true? is Ukrainian ill-functioning society or high-functioning society? And how can we explain this to empirical observations happening simultaneously? So in my work and also in working with my colleagues, we identified at least three major variables that contribute to this mobilization and to the resilience of Ukrainian society. And these three variables are basically identity, social capital, and political institutions. And now I will explain what I mean by that. So first of all, national identity matters. We know from surveys that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, about 40% of Ukrainians said that they are actually Ukrainians. Most of the people were saying that, you know, I belong to this village, I belong to this city, like local identity mattered a lot. And I was born in Soviet Union. This kind of meta identities mattered, but the national identity was not the top first choice. Today, it's completely different. About 80% of Ukrainians would say that they are Ukrainians and that they're proud of the Ukrainian state. And this mobilization around national identity matters quite a lot. And it's a big factor to explain what happens in Ukrainian society today. And this kind of identity matters even more than language, usage of language, for instance. So we know that people who speak Russian language or people who speak Ukrainian language, they can share the same sentiment. Both of them can say that they are Ukrainians. And we also know from our research that, let's say, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian and a Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainian can support the same political party or the same president. Well, not always, but often. So yeah, so this sense of identity, I think, was crucially underestimated. We also know that social capital matters, and social capital here means basically the resources which people can get from social ties. When people or communities communicate with each other, exchange experiences, exchange resources, do things together, this contributes significantly to the resilience. I'll give you some examples. So we studied Ukrainian local communities during the invasion. And some of these communities were close to the front lines. Some of them were far away from the front lines. But, you know, they all had to execute some activities like to collect garbage or to make sure that water is running in the pipelines or to accept displaced people. And you can quantify all these activities and you can come up with an index of resilience. And we know that this index is higher in communities with stronger business associations. Like people come together, they are entrepreneurial, they do stuff together, and this has an impact then on the kind of managerial capacity of this community. What also matters is that local activism matters, and even the fact that sometimes communities interact with each other. You know, sometimes communities have partnership deals, like they trade with each other or they exchange information, or even mentorship happens between local governments. So during the invasion, it provides you opportunity to cooperate. You know, you can just call your friend in another community and you can say like, look, we have some displaced people. Can you accept them? Or you have a generator. Can you send this generator to us? So these horizontal ties between people and also between communities, they matter quite a lot. And this is a big part of what is happening today in Ukraine. And the third big variable is not about people, is more about institutions. After 2014, after Euromaidan revolution, Ukrainian government executed a lot of significant reforms that allowed people to be more independent and to have more agency. For instance, the reform of decentralization. I don't know how much you know about this reform, but in the nutshell, Ukraine used to be a very, very centralized society, that the capital city, Kyiv, decided everything on how to collect taxes and how to spend taxes in local communities. But now local communities have more agency. For instance, it has changed during the invasion, but for many years, there was this there was a law which said that if you have a business and business earns money, so 60% of income tax remains in the community. It's a lot of money, So people and local mayors were incentivized to invite more businesses and more entrepreneurs to their communities so they can build businesses, they can pay salaries, taxes, and they will have more money for public good, which actually shifted a lot of dynamic in Ukraine. A lot of things now happening at the local level with a lot of local autonomy and local agency. So it is not a surprise that specifically at the local level, Ukrainians were mobilized to defend their communities, because it was not just about intangible things like identity, it was also about tangible things. They were satisfied with the performances of the communities, they were satisfied with the fact that they were allowed to vote for the mayors or against the mayors. And also it provides legal infrastructure to people to do stuff. For instance, even the thing as territorial defense legally emerged maybe in 2018 or 19. So people were received this legal right to serve in local militia, for instance. So given that these three variables matter quite a lot, I would say that we should take them into account when we analyze Ukraine and when we think what's next. I followed some surveys, and I remember specifically there is a panel conducted by the research company Gradus, and the rankings measured as a desire to vote for Zelensky. This desire was quite low even a few months ago. Like 16% of people said that they would vote for Zelensky. In the preparation for this event, it went up from 16 to 23. After the event,
the Oval Office,
yeah. It went from 23 to 28. So basically, there is this effect of mobilizing around the state, around the president happening even now. So yeah, Alexandra talked about challenges, but it's a paradox that it seems like these challenges also provide these opportunities to rally around the flag, because there is still enough of social capital and identity mobilization which happens in Ukraine right now. So whatever will be put on table with negotiations, Zelensky will be basically, how to say it, he will have to think very carefully about the societal response, because societal pressure is very high on him in Ukraine. Yeah, so that's it. This is a summary of our research and our understanding of Ukrainian society, and I think we can answer to your questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, hi, I'm Dan Epstein. I work for the Scholars Without Borders at the Davis Center, supporting people scholars affected by the war in Ukraine. I have what is a little bit of an awkward question coming from someone who has never been in the military, has never fought in a military conflict, has never really contemplated volunteering or joining the military. What are the prospects for Ukrainian government increasing its numbers of people, not just men, but also women, under arms?
Yeah, I can start answering.
Please.
Yeah, so basically, please don't worry. I also never served in military, and basically the attitude in Ukrainian society now, I would say, how to put it, you should not feel awkward asking these questions, because after living in war for a couple years, people don't care, It just some people serve in army, some people don't serve, but they still do their job, maybe for economy or for university. So it's fine. We all play our role. There is a huge pressure. We see it in surveys. There are two different ways to ask this question in a survey. So if you ask a question about trust of military, do you trust the military? Like 90% of Ukrainians would say that they trust the military today. Of course, because military army people are the heroes that defend. But if you ask specifically whether you trust to these military offices, recruiting offices, then the trust would be very low, and it's going down. And it reflects the fact that Ukrainian society is not satisfied with the policy of recruitment. it is a very difficult situation for the government because they cannot stop recruiting people, but also they don't know how to recruit people. So what happens now is that there are in parallel different policies implemented. There is like an official centralized way to recruit people, but there are also official new volunteering offices that are opened up in each region of Ukraine. There are parallel recruiting options because we also know from surveys that, well, basically there are people who are willing to serve, but they say, obviously, we're afraid to serve. We're afraid that our training, our background does not match to what we will do in the military. So what the government tries to do, they try to say, well, look, we need all kinds of people. We need procurement officers, we need drivers, we need lawyers, we need IT experts to work with drones. So government tries to promote this kind of recruitment. It doesn't go well, yeah, to be honest. But still, I mean, some people respond to this positively. So another interesting variable which we know from surveys, and I will refer here to National Academy of Science of Ukraine, the attitude, the positive attitude towards mobilization correlates with age, meaning each next generation, the older the person is, the more likely this person is to support the draft. And there are two different interpretations. One is more cynical, and another is less cynical. So the cynical interpretation would be that, you know, old people are not going to fight. So they don't have skin in the game. So of course they support it. But there is another thing, and I think we should not forget about it, that people who are more adults, who live in Ukraine for many years, they've seen a lot. They lived under the Soviet rule. They witnessed, you know, they interacted with Russia in the 90s. They see in 2014, they experienced occupation of Crimea. So maybe it's also the message that, you know, they know that if we don't stop Russia today, then their children or grandchildren will suffer from the future wars. So this is less cynical, but I think also correct interpretation. I think these two interpretations, they go together. So yeah, to answer to your question shortly, there is a lot of pressure. It is a really bad situation, but still there are resources if government makes it in a more kind of smart way, using applications and correct recruitment tools. I think it can be possible.
I would also add to that is when we think of what Ukrainian society might look like later, it's pretty clear that Ukraine will have to have a large military, right? People are talking of the Israeli model. And one of the ways that we feel this is that there are rules that tell universities like ours, you need to provide basic training for all sophomores, for all sophomore men.
Mm-hmm.
And probably it won't be only men going forward, but the idea is you're going to have a country that can defend itself, particularly when you see that other partners like the United States are not going to be there all the time. Chris?
You said at the beginning that no one wants the war to end more than the Ukrainians, but they want to be sure that the war doesn't start again. Can you talk a little bit about if there's been a shift in sort of what the Ukrainian population, and obviously it's not homogenous, would be willing to accept in terms of a ceasefire, given how long the war has gone on and given the shift in American support?
Yeah, so yeah, unfortunately I didn't prepare the slides, but there are surveys conducted by so many different polling companies, Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, Razumkov Center, Gradus, all of them try to, with different methodologies, understand this. And it's very difficult to ask this question directly. So there are kind of indirect ways to ask this question. And Kyiv Institute does it in a way that they ask, do you believe that there is only military way to finish the war or also diplomatic way? And this choice of diplomatic has increased significantly. So I would say even 2 or 2.5 years ago, 80% would say that it is only military. Now, it's somewhere between 50-50, yeah, approximately. So more and more people accept the idea that some diplomatic solution should happen. What we still don't know, what are the terms? Because here is that, you know, as you said, society is not homogeneous, so people put different interpretation in what diplomacy is and peace is. And from the surveys that I know, I think Ukrainians understand that ceasefire is a break for Russia to attack. So basically the mood is, yes, ceasefire is important, we need diplomacy, but this idea of security guarantees is very big in Ukrainian society. Yeah.
Irina?
My name is Rima Musigina. I'm from the Davis Center. Thank you very much. I would like to ask you to make a connection between what Alexander said and what Timothy said, because the intonation of your speech were very different. Because you said this is a Bible society, this is, and Alexander, you said this is actually the things look very bad now. My question probably more to you, Timothy, and in what kind of language it is discussed, what America is doing to Ukraine. So what are the reactions? How the people talk about it?
In the same dynamic.
Yeah.
It's bad, but it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but on a serious note, my answer still will be kind of the same. People debating quite a lot, but I see. So I don't have now some surveys or quantitative evidence. So I'm going to talk more about anecdotal evidence and what I observe in social media and what I observe among experts and how people talk about it. So people are mobilized. Sort of basically, it is a stage of, acceptance that now we are in this new kind of bad scenario and we have to embrace this bad scenario. And from my friends in military circles, I know that they're now talking more about China than America, because basically what happens now is that people accept, okay, it is likely we're not going to receive American military help. And as Alexander said, American military help now is mostly patriots, it is a defense system, mostly. So according to this, people I know in my circles, the mood is that what's really important in the front line, everything is about drones. So the capacity to produce drones is very important. And technology to produce drones comes from China. So China provides drones to both Russia and Ukraine. And that's what worries Ukrainians now. They're like, okay, without American patriots, it would be very difficult. I can move from Kyiv to Ternopil, But what about drones? This is a really, really big question now in Ukraine. So I think the mood is exactly like that. People are anxious, people are angry, people are dissatisfied, but people are also mobilized, saying like, it's life. It's life, and we have to navigate in these new complicated circumstances.
The other interesting thing is that, Ukrainians are so used to bad news now, right? So like in America, you're like, oh, Trump, like the world is over. What are we going to do? And Ukraine, they're like, another bad day. Yeah. So more terrible news, like what are we going to do to continue surviving? And to some extent, like because they've fought for 3 years, they're like, we'll overcome this as well, right? Don't know how, don't know why, don't know when. But it's not like, this is the end. We have to give up because life is over.
Yeah, there was I think you have been waiting for a very long time.
I want to pick back up on the mobilization question. So
Can you introduce yourself?
yes, hi, I'm Sophia. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Government. I study political theory, like war ethics and international relations, but some stuff on Ukraine and Russia too. Right, okay, the mobilization question. So you were basically saying there's a lot of variation in public opinion in the Zelensky example. I'm wondering if there's similar data on public opinion around mobilization and whether or not you can look, or whether or not someone is or could be looking at like small trends in motivations to sign up, to enlist, and like use that to make future decision making.
Yeah, it actually happened. So Ukrainian government it is a paradox, and I think it would be interesting for you as political scholars, that sometimes it is extremely centralized because during the war you must have centralized decision making, and sometimes it is chaotic and disorganized. So from my own understanding and my communication with different people, there are multiple groups who try to solve this issue. Some of them work with the Office of President. Some of them work with Ministry of Defense. Some of them work with Ministry of Veterans. Some of them are NGOs. Some of them have foreign roots. Some of them are local. So it's like there are many, many teams of people who try to think about how can we solve mobilization. And people have multiple backgrounds. Sometimes they come from business. So they approach it as a business, how to say it, as a marketing question. How will you sell this idea? Sometimes they come from the government or from military. And and I interact with many people like that, trying to provide data or advice. And I know the fact that they always look into surveys. The surveys also are these ad hoc, disaggregated, different companies provide different surveys. Like there is this company called InfoSapiens, and they specifically surveyed men, population, about their fears of being mobilized. So the fear is like, it's of course it's about death and being captured, but it was something like number 3. Number first and number 2 fear were like, I'm not sure which brigade I will serve in. I'm not sure whether it will be a high quality brigade or low quality brigade, because brigades are also disorganized. Some brigades are contemporary, like NATO style professionals, and some of them like outdated Soviet style brigades. So people don't know, if I'm going to be enlisted, will I receive proper training or will I just go to the front line immediately? And these surveys were taken by the ministry in order to design like advertisements and kind of like just to convince men to say like, look, we understand your pain, we will provide training for you, things like that. So messaging was adjusted after surveys. And there are also independent brigades and military units that invest in their own advertisement and advertising campaign. It looks, for me, it's already natural, because I live in Kyiv and see it every day. It's so organic. But maybe if you come to Kyiv, it would be surprising to see. It looks like any regular advertisement. You go to the city center and there is like McDonald's or Pepsi Cola. Oh, our military brigade is so great. You should enlist.
And it will
be advertised.
Yeah, action movie
right,
advertisement.
or a picture of like a girl on the back of a motorcycle,
Yeah.
like with a pistol in her
Yeah.
hand, right? I mean, it's
Sort of like that. So it is a reflection that everyone is doing their own thing. It's very disorganized. I don't know which one is to my knowledge, or at least I do not have access to data to compare which one is more efficient. Is it the state or it is independent brigades? Who is more efficient in enlisting people? I don't know. I would love to know, but I don't have access to such data.
maybe that could be your research.
I know,
project.
maybe I'll come do that.
Yeah, but even our students. So basically, students are motivated to receive some military training because they're very pragmatic. It's not just about patriotism, it's also pragmatism. They think, well, what if in 5 or 10 years, what if Russia attacks again? What if I have to serve in army? I should be trained somehow. So it is a pragmatic, rational desire to be trained. So they're looking for opportunities to be trained. And sometimes students come to our office and they demand some tactical medicine training or geography map training. They actually come to us and say like, we as student union demand more training in tactical medicine. So yeah, so people think about it very every day. Yeah.
Tom Reddick, I'm visiting in the government department here. From the standpoint of what Russian public opinion is like, the distribution of views within Russia about war, it seems incontestable that there's widespread support for the war among Russians, but not universal. And anecdotally, there appear to be pockets of opposition to the war. We had a talk by our Murza the other day here that said when he was in prison, he received tons of letters from people who were sympathetic to him. Who knows how widespread opposition to the war actually is? But I'm wondering how much Ukrainians are able to be in communication with Russians through family channels or social media, or I don't know what channels.
Yeah.
And bring to Russians some realization of what in fact is happening. It's not reflected in Russian state propaganda.
It is a very big debate now in Ukraine. in population, but also among scholars. When the invasion just happened, maybe after 2 months of the invasion, I participated in a survey together with my friends, colleagues from Northwestern and from McGill University. So we arranged a survey among Ukrainian population. And we asked the question, do you have relatives in Russia? Do you relatives broadly, uncle, cousin, something like that? So about half of people said, yeah, we have someone in Russia. Do you communicate with them now during the invasion? Most of them did communicate, like 65% did communicate. And then we asked, how is it going? Like, are you happy with communication? Do you think they trust you or do they trust Russian propaganda? And then it was crazy, like 100% of people said, no, they don't trust us. They trust Russian television. And it was shocking. I mean, now I have already accepted it, but 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, it was such a big existential shock to me. My wife has relatives in Russia. We were calling them, they were calling us. You cannot imagine the emotional trauma because my wife basically received calls from her relatives denying what's happening in Ukraine. Yeah. And this made Ukrainians very upset and angry. So I do not believe that anyone will try it again. After it didn't work once, people won't try it again. But you can make another argument. You still can be pragmatic about it. You cannot just drop it. You know, you must have some influence over Russian society, even from security perspective. Maybe you want to have your own disinformation or psychological operations have some, it's a warfare, and warfare is not just about military, it's also about sending propaganda to Russia. So a lot of people thinking about it in Ukraine. What should we do to understand Russian society or influence Russian society? And yeah, I know people who are running kind of surveys in Russia even today, using digital tools, online panels, things like that. And they are still they try to understand whether Russians kind of, can be influenced through kind of with experimental design. And to my best knowledge, nothing has worked yet. So it seems like the society is, I don't know even how to say it, like very resistant to information from Ukraine. So yeah, my point is that I think you should try to have some informational exchange, but it is very, very difficult. And I think it should be done in some, tactical, smart way, but you should not expect that Ukrainians would just, open their minds and say, of course, I want to talk to my uncle. No, it's not realistic.
I'm Rochelle Rinschab, I'm a Center Associate. And sort of piggybacking on that question, could you talk a little bit about the occupied territories in Ukraine and what opportunities are there for communication and what sorts of resistance has developed there?
Yeah, the communication happens. Still people, it's very difficult to organize, but there are NGOs and there are activists on both sides who try to help. And even in our university, we have students who were in occupied territories. And usually the channel is, they have to go somewhere deep in Russia. And then from Russia, they travel to Belarus. And from Belarus, they travel to Lithuania. And then they go to Poland. And then they come to Ukraine. And then they come to our university. So there are many kind of ways around it. But it's very costly. It's very difficult. Yeah. What can I say? It's monitoring and communication happens, but at a very high cost.
I mean, there are some UN teams, including Noel Calhoun, if any of you knew her when she was a PhD student here. She works at the UN office in Kyiv on war crimes, and they're just coming out at the end of the month with a report on children in the occupied territories. So I don't know how they're able to do their research. I know they asked us if we had students who were in the university that had come from there. It's very difficult to get information. There are things happening. There is communications, including like partisan activities. But it's not maybe a black box, but it's a very dark box. There was a question in the very back there. Yeah. No,
So forgive me for asking me the stupid questions. I'm from Kharkov and I think recognize the picture where, yes. So maybe my brain is flooded with my questions are stupid. But I don't quite understand. Wouldn't it be easier for Europeans to stop buying gas instead of giving it the financial aid, because maybe it would balance? And also, I don't quite understand, when the war started, at least this is what my classmates are telling me, you could live to Europe without even a passport. Why at least all the women and children get out from the bombs?
Well,
It makes no sense to me.
there is a joke now in Ukraine. Like, it's easier to convince NATO to come to Ukraine than to convince your grandma to move from. I don't know. So there are, of course, all people are different, and there are different motivations to move or not to move. But it is true. It was so difficult to convince people to move away, to convince them to participate in evacuation. I have friends, like my faculty, one of the faculty members, basically his relatives are from the Donetsk region. And quite recently, they decided to go back to their village because a cherry tree, a dog, something like that. So people really stick to their places. And even I had this psychological transition because, in my life, I used to travel. I was a Fulbrighter. I studied in the Netherlands, in Spain. I thought of myself as a global person. But when the invasion started, I became this version, like I was born in Kyiv and I will die in Kyiv and no one will move me. And it was stupid. I know it was stupid, but it was just emotional mobilization. And that's what you have to work with. And another part of it is, it's not just about psychology. It's not only about people, but also it's about infrastructure, how to evacuate people. Sometimes it's difficult, even if people would like to be evacuated. It's not easy to arrange it. Yeah, so it is a combination of factors. Error can happen anywhere. Sometimes it's difficult to convince people, but even if you convince them, then you have to organize logistics. So it's just very complicated. And also many people, I remember this in the beginning of invasion, people, well, of course, some of people had a desire to move abroad, but a lot of people were looking for a safe place in Ukraine, like a village closer to the border with Poland. Just, to be like in between. I'm still staying in Ukraine, but if something bad happens, I can move. And then I think a lot of people just missed the opportunity to move because now the borders are closed. Yeah, and so there are many, many factors to it. But yeah, it's not so easy as you would expect to travel and to convince people to travel. And a lot of people came back. We have students who came back. We have colleagues who came back, but yeah, someone never came back. It really varies a lot. And about the gas question,
I can talk about that. So I know gas prices in New England went up dramatically this winter. They've gone up even more in Europe. So when you say, why can't the Europeans stop buying gas? The fact is, like, the prices are almost at the point where there's going to be political problems as a result of it. And if they cut off all the gas, probably like the political parties that support Ukraine will not win their elections. So that's one factor. When it comes to oil, when the Western countries were thinking about how to reduce oil revenues, they were very intent on not wanting to reduce Russian production. The Russians produce 11 million barrels of oil a day, and it was important to the global elite, let's say in the West, that they continue producing that oil, because if they don't, the price is going to go up, inflation is going to go up, and then you have other political problems. So they wanted to squeeze Russia's ability to make money on the basis of that oil, but not to stop producing that oil. And that was one of the reasons why for so long the Western companies were reluctant to give Ukraine the capacity to strike oil producing facilities in Russia, because they're like, oh no, like, what if we don't get oil and our oil prices go up? But people got over it, right? But it's mostly connected, I think, with domestic politics in countries that would see higher prices. Misha?
Yeah, I'm technical tourist visiting at the data center and lecture school. So, do you think ceasefire or and potentially a peace treaty can be feasible in foreseeable future? And what would be the risks of a ceasefire and a peace treaty for Ukraine? Let's just.
I mean, we might have different opinions. I think it is feasible, and I think Ukraine doesn't have a lot of options. Basically, we're in a very, very bad situation. It is a very tough negotiation, and I think that's not many options that we can select from. So I think most likely Ukraine will accept whatever ceasefire on the table, knowing that the risk is that Russia will attack again in 2-5 years. So Ukrainians will both sides will take it as a break to invest in security and military.
Yeah, and I would distinguish between the ceasefire and the peace treaty, right? I mean, even in Korea, we don't have a peace treaty, we have an armistice. And I think that's what's on the table here, in part because Ukraine will not accept to give up the occupied territories completely. So nobody, I think, in Ukraine still thinks that it's feasible to get them back now. But that's very different from saying we never are going to get them back, right? The attitude is, well, look at the Baltics after World War II. Eventually, they were liberated from the Soviet Union. Look at East Germany. Eventually, it was reunited with West Germany. So there may be a bad situation for a certain period of time, but it's not going to be forever. People won't accept that. The real problem is, and this comes back to the question of security guarantees, like a ceasefire is only as good as your ability to keep the two sides from thinking they're better off shooting than not shooting. And the only way that the Russians can be convinced to stop shooting is if they think there are consequences. Ukraine alone can't provide the kinds of consequences right now that would disincentivize Russia from attacking and seizing the advantage, which is, again, why they're focused on security guarantees. Either you give us so much weaponry that we can significantly attack to deter Russia, or you have to have your people here and assume that Putin won't risk killing them because he's afraid of some kind of bigger response. And neither of those options seem to be on the table right now. So even though Ukraine is in a very bad situation, if there's an agreement without security guarantees, first of all, it's not going to be easy to stop some Ukrainians from shooting, right? Especially if the Russians continue. And second of all, no one believes that it's a durable agreement. And if no one believes it's a durable agreement, it's not really a ceasefire, right? It's just like another piece of paper. I think, Emily, did you have a question?
Yeah, Emily Hacker, master's student at the data center. It's a bit of a pivot, but seeing as you're both in the university environment, I was just wondering how you've sort of seen universities adapt, change, and also going off of your comment about students seeking specific trainings or specific courses, maybe even a specific question about what sort of fields of study students are pursuing in response to living in war.
What a great question, Timothy. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there are many ways to approach a question, from kind of strategic and how the government thinks about it, how people think about it. And there are romantic type of this story and also cynical type answer as well. So I will try to structure my answer somehow. So in my opinion, this is a time when basically Ukrainian educational system is trialed and only good universities will survive. I think that a lot of universities and educational institutions will just die out in Ukraine because they are not capable to match with the challenge. And the challenge is that the government doesn't have money. Public universities, they will just don't have resources. The challenge is demographic. Students will choose universities in Western Ukraine because parents tell them it's safer. Or due to the prospects of European integration, students would rather choose a mediocre university in Poland versus the best university in Ukraine. So it is a challenge, and I think only few good universities will survive. And this is also kind of ideological debate here, because the government doesn't think about it that way. The government wants to support everyone because it's a public good, and the government wants to provide public good. But I think it's not efficient. I would rather, select universities with capacity, support them, and everyone else will disappear. And this is more, it's a cynical way, to address it, but that's a debate in Ukraine, and I'm on this side of only few top universities will survive. From the perspective of student motivation, a lot of students, and again, good stories and bad stories. Bad stories is that it is true that some people motivated, that university is like a deferral that protects you from army. Some people, rather than being drafted, they would apply to university as a way to avoid army. We see it in the data that more males apply to PhD or master programs than ever in history of Ukraine. So this is true. I don't want to sugarcoat it, but also there are many good things that I also observe. Students now are very much motivated. They want to be useful during this war. In my own university, I remember 5 years ago, the motivation of students was like, we want to study a bit and then we will go abroad. It's like a booster to go abroad. Now students apply because they say, we want to rebuild Ukraine. We want to stay in Ukraine. We want to be useful. And they select programs that are relevant during the war. For instance, and this is a very broad range of programs. Like students can be interested in psychology because they want to heal society, so much trauma, someone has to deal with that. Students are interested in urban studies because someone has to rebuild cities. Students would be interested in history because, well, we want to understand our identity, why the war happened. So this is a motivation. And engineering is growing. Vocational training and engineering training, undergrad, graduate level, is very hot now. People care about drones. People care about cybersecurity, what is called dual-use technology. Because today the common understanding is that, okay, drones today are used to deliver bombs or to collect intelligence, but tomorrow the same technology will be used to repair things or for logistics or for, I don't know, gathering artificial intelligence, some high-level image information. So there are a lot of people who are motivated by this entrepreneurial spirit. We need these technologies today to survive, but tomorrow these technologies will be used to rebuild the country and bring economic prosperity. So that's why a lot of people now paying attention to engineering. And this actually influenced our own strategy. Even though we are called Kyiv School of Economics, but recently we launched a program in engineering, which is quite awkward because why economists working on engineering, but it was a success. We received a lot of students because there is a lot of demand. Students want to study engineering. And we also just launched, well, not launched, we are in the process of launching our own vocational training programs, because that's what people need now. They need to receive very quick education, acquire new skills to be useful in the economy today, because we have what economists call structural gap. Structural gap means there are a lot of jobs and a lot of people seeking jobs, but you cannot match them because people don't have skills. They used to live in East with chemical industry, but they moved to West with agriculture. They want to work in agriculture, but they don't have skills. So those universities that can provide quick retraining, which is called reskill and upskill programs, this would be the best, the most useful universities, and this will be the most successful university.
And if I could just add as a footnote, right? USAID was very involved in preparing these programs, and basically that's all gone.
Yep.
And so now the question is, like, how are you going to be able to structure those programs, which everyone agrees is essential. Julian?
My name is Julian. I'm also a master's student at the Davis Center. Last week, former Board Minister Kyiv was on campus, and we had a talk about the NPT, non-proliferation treaty. And maybe this is more a question for Alexandra. Alexandra, what are the chances that the NPT survives the end of the conflict? Or maybe from Kyiv's point of view, what is the what are the discussions about the future? Maybe not from Ukraine's, like, for Ukraine's ability to build nuclear weapons, but Poland, South Korea, Japan.
So one of the active discussions now, right, is about Europe's nuclear security, right? And could the nuclear weapons owned by France and the UK be a nuclear umbrella that would protect Germany as well? I mean, in Germany, some are even talking about whether they should be developing nuclear weapons, which is kind of an amazing place to be. But more generally, I think a lot of countries have realized that if you have nuclear weapons, people won't really attack you, right? So the fact that Russia is able to talk about nuclear escalation and get the US to pull back makes everybody else say, oh, well, those nuclear weapons, they sure are useful. Even if you never use them, you can just say that you're going to use them and people will stop attacking you. So of course, smaller countries are thinking like, get me some of those, right? Because that's the only thing that will protect you. So I would be very surprised. I mean, it won't last in its current manifestation, but I think it's going to be pretty difficult to get people to agree not to pursue nuclear weapons, if only because saying you're pursuing them, even if you're not pursuing them, is a deterrent. I think Laura has a question from Zoom.
So what is going on with Ukraine's candidacy for being a part of the European Union, and what implications can that have with Russia and war?
Yeah, we pretend like everything is fine, and we are still working on acceptance to European Union. Well, acceptance to European Union actually means very specific steps. You have to adjust your legal system, vote for many amendments in your legislation, implement policies, and there is a plan to do it. And as long as we are on track, we have chances to be accepted in European Union. And this is actually happening despite all the troubles with Oval Office and okay. There is a communication between European Commission officers, between Ukrainian Ministry of Economics, because it's a powerhouse which leads this process. So it just many people in the Ukrainian government just working on this adaptation of policies.
So I would also add that, the EU is still coming to Ukraine and saying, how can we train armies of Ukrainians to be future European bureaucrats, right? Like help us set up a school in order to do that. But if you look actually at what it takes to get into the European Union, like all of the clusters, all of the requirements, I mean, if it happens in 10 years, it would be a miracle, right? So it's useful in that it provides a framework, and this is what's happened with other countries. Like, it allows you some political cover when you say like, oh, I'm sorry, we have to kind of fire all the traffic cops and rehire them, but EU requires us to stop corruption, right? Too bad. So it gives some political cover for some difficult decisions, but the fact is that it lasts so long that it's pretty difficult to keep the momentum unless you have an existential threat like Ukraine. I think Anna had a question.
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm a Ukrainian student at the REAP program. And my question regards Russian psyops. So Russia is kind of notorious for those. And my sense, given my circles here in the US and in Ukraine, is that Ukrainians are better trained, better adjusted to interacting and reacting to Russian psyops. Maybe you could talk to how they look in Ukraine right now, how do Ukrainians deal with them, and maybe what are the lessons for American audiences to pick up from that experience of living in Russian psyops for like tens of years.
It's a complicated question. I think I would love to agree with you, but I also think it's a bit of mythology. I think that you can never be ready for psychological operations and misinformation. But I agree that Ukrainians have been exposed to so many cases of misinformation that maybe there is a kind of more intuitive understanding and mistrust to news and misinformation. So yeah, I think there are some experience that you can learn from. But I would not say that Ukrainians are, kind of super well trained in this. My understanding is that a lot of misinformation is spread specifically through Telegram, TikTok, Instagram. And according to surveys, these are exactly the most popular sources of information in Ukraine. Moreover, these sources of information are popular specifically to consume news about economics and politics and geopolitics. So yeah, it's a high risk. It's a high risk that people consume information from this. And there is this excellent, I really love them, NGO called Texty.org.ua, and they conducted a study showing that a lot of misinformation comes, like the narratives, they come from TikTok. So TikTok, which originated somewhere in Russia, then picked up by Ukrainian TikToks, and you can see it. So I think what are the lessons learned is that it is okay to move fast. And there were a lot of debates somewhere in 2015 when Ukraine prohibited Russian internet websites, Yandex, Vkontakte, which was a very big social media. And it was a debate sort of like, well, freedom of speech, it's bad to prohibit things. But I think it was a best decision we ever made, because we identified that this is a source of misinformation and we have just to cut it because it's a very big risk. And I think this is a major lesson learned, that even in democratic societies, you have to be very fast and courageous to identify and make these difficult moves to ban media, or to stop the spread of information, because information can be harmful. So this is one lesson, just be courageous in shutting down media sources. The second source of lesson learned would be, and I know that it would sound biased, and I acknowledge it, I know, be with me, do not trust Russian media, never, ever. Like, I think the risk is so high that it's better to be risk averse. Like just in case, do not trust them at all. And I think it's a very big thing, because basically reasonable people who think about themselves as reasonable, usually what we do as reasonable people, we get information from various sources, and we search that somewhere in between the truth is. So we say, well, I will listen to a Ukrainian media source and to Russian media source, and the truth is somewhere in between. But I would say that it is so skewed that you will never get the reality somewhere in between. That's why you have to stay away from Russian sources. Yes, sorry for saying that. And another thing is that, I forgot what I wanted to say. I wanted to say something profound and smart, but...
Two out of three is not bad.
Now, I guess it's very difficult to learn it, how to say it. There is this naive idea that you can establish some study programs to address misinformation. There are many NGOs in Ukraine that try to give your kind of lessons learned or top 10 activities that you can do to avoid misinformation. I don't think it works. You just have to be on alert every day. And now I remember.
Yes.
And you have to be very proactive. Basically, what we learned in our experience, and again, I understand it will sound maybe on the borders of ethics, but you have to be very proactive. I think the Ukrainians survive and defend against Russian misinformation because we also use misinformation and psyops. We are very proactive. They attack us, we attack them. And, and I think a lot of Europeans are afraid of doing this. So the idea of Europe is to build a wall. Like, Russian propaganda will not penetrate us if we build a wall of fact checkers. But I think it's not going to work. You just have to build your own narratives and be more proactive.
That was profound, actually.
Thank you.
Nargis.
Nargis Kasyanova, I run the program at Central East Data Center. Well, since you're coming from the Kyiv School of Economics, I wanted to ask what pillars of Ukrainian economy you kind of envision post-war, and how do you envision the post-war political economy of the country? And I'm thinking about Japan, how they managed to kind of rechannel mobilization from the military sector to the economic, and how it became the Japan incorporated after the war, even kind of how the the oligarchs, so it's how the economy kind of was structured, before. Probably it's not the best,
Let's actually
the best foundation.
let's collect questions. I think there was another one here. No? Yes,
I'm curious about the gender dynamics of what you're seeing at Kyiv School of Economics. Israel has over a long period, because of central role of the military, even though women serve in it, it affects gender relations. What are women choosing to take, and are you seeing anything? Maybe you're not seeing anything, but there are lots of ways that gender can be.
Okay, any other questions while we're collecting? Yes?
About journalism, the state of journalism, to follow up on the disinformation issue, whether there's any growth in that area as a counter to the media.
And there was another.
Oh, yep.
Actually, I don't know if Kyiv School of Economics, so thank you so much for being here. I have a question regarding employment opportunities for students today, because we've heard that Visa, MasterCard, even McKinsey opens the office soon, and Horizon Capital. Like, do you see this activization of the employment opportunities?
Yeah, I can answer to all of this question.
Go for it. I'm going to relax.
So with Visa, it's terrifying to us because we have a lot of faculty in computer science who also work in Visa simultaneously. And they told us that they were told that they will be summoned to work in offices physically, which means they won't be able to work at us anymore. So yeah, there are opportunities like that, and people are talking about it and planning it, but it's and I will tie to your question as well, it's a small part of economy anyway. You know, it benefits our alumni because our alumni work in either finance or banking sector, but it's not enough to fuel economy of Ukraine. And most jobs that will be created soon, they are still in logistics, energy, agriculture, things like that. To your question about the future of economy, yeah, it's still the same. The idea that energy, logistics, and agriculture are the main pillars is still, it's kind of what people believe in and what people now invest in and think about. And when I say energy, it's a bit of everything. It's a solar energy, but also it's a nuclear energy. So people are looking into different things. Logistics is very important because of European Union integration and move of products and to Europe and back. Seaports, this is a big thing. But I guess, you know, that's maybe a wishful thinking, but what Ukrainians are trying to achieve, and the big debate is about these dual-use technologies, and that maybe the future of Ukrainian economy is kind of similar to Israel model, like a lot of startups that are connected to technology in security and dual-use technologies.
Can I just say one thing there? I would like to talk for a second about dual-use technology. So one thing that's interesting about the role that they play in Ukraine is that in the West, usually you develop a piece of civilian technology and then it turns out to have a military use. The question in Ukraine is going to be in the opposite direction. You have something that has a military application, and the question is, how are you going to turn it into civilian use? And here I want to give a shout out to Lauren Graham. I see Pat Graham is here. He wrote a brilliant book called Lonely Ideas about the difficulty that Soviet and before them Russian and then after them Russian scientists had in commercializing their inventions. And the same is still true in Ukraine. One of the reasons we have a business school is because you have all of these brilliant people inventing things. They're doing it because they're serving the military. That's their way of serving. But when you talk to them about how they can commercialize this so that they can take advantage of dual use, they're pretty uninterested.
Yeah.
Right. So that is an ongoing problem in future economic development.
Yeah, and this can also influence the political economy because it seems like right now the kind of oligarchs, they don't have the same power anymore. Most of them used to own industries specifically in eastern and southern Ukraine, and these industries are destroyed or captured. So for them, of course, they are willing to fight back to get these resources back, but maybe it's even too costly to take it back and rebuild it. So I think there is a lot of uncertainty, and we see that right now, people who are considered to be rich and powerful in Ukraine, they're not the same oligarchs as before. It's not like coal miners and chemical infrastructure. It's more retail is very big now. If you purchase Ukrainian Forbes and you just list it, it will be retail, then IT, again retail, again IT, pharmacology. So things that are related to industry is going down in this list. And I think it will profoundly shape our political economy in the future. There is no these big powerhouses like big oligarchs who own industry and media, and they appoint their politicians. I don't think we will see it soon. But there are some people like that under the shadows who are trying doing these things, but I don't think that they are powerful as they used to be. There was also a question about gender. I think we benefit from being a private university, and universities like Ukrainian Catholic University, Kyiv School of Economics, were private, so we can manipulate admission campaign. We can set higher prices, and we can also invest more in advertisement. So basically, we don't see any gender disparities in both universities, but in public universities, I think gender disparities are still present. And as I said, male population wants to apply to master programs and PhD programs now, but yeah, that's life.
Although the balancing factor is that for mobility programs, like programs abroad, sorry, that air raid in Kiev, we can only send women abroad.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I wasn't thinking so much about disparities in entrance. I was thinking of who gets to go abroad, who's needed in jobs, what's the positive cachet of coming back from the front versus not coming back from the front, or getting military training.
Well, getting back from the front is not easy, right? Because once you're in, you're not coming out. But one of the expressions that we have, we're thinking about engineering. We would love to be able to send students to Olin for a semester, and it's basically right now STEM for femme. Right. We're going to be sending women abroad because it's just too high risk for the university and the government to be sending men abroad.
Yeah.
So that's going to affect, the gender. Women going in fields they wouldn't have gone into before. That's the kind of thing.
That's one of the famous projects now. It was initiated by UNDP. A lot of male tractor drivers are serving in army now, fixing tanks or driving tanks. So someone have to drive tractors, and a lot of females were retrained to do that. But in academia, things like that also happen. So maybe in the future it will change the gender structure in academia. It's interesting. Would be cool.
Yeah.
And there was a question about journalism. It's a broad question. I think there is again, there are many debates in Ukraine. There was a moment, I think things change dynamically. When the invasion just started, there was a lot of mobilization, and maybe you've heard something about this national marathon. Major Ukrainian TV channels united together to work in coordination and provide 24 hours information. And in the beginning, it was praised like a good activity because it mobilizes. It also works against misinformation, like it's a governmental verified high quality information. Today, this is more criticized. The accusation is that government also is biased in selecting information, which has to be provided through this marathon. But I don't think, how to say it? It's still a debate, but I don't think that it's very close to kind of authoritarian or something like that through media. There are still plenty of different information, and each channel has its own unique vibe and stuff. I think media experts were mobilized to address misinformation, as you say. A lot of a lot of people who are experts in psyops come from media, but I think that the most difficult challenge now is that it's kind of pre-selection issue, that the best people who work in academia and the best people who work in media and the best people who work in NGO and in businesses, all of them are also, they're good citizens. And many of them volunteered to serve in army. And now media do not have capacity to execute all the projects that they want to execute. I have friends in Forbes and some other media, and basically they say, we cannot execute even half of our ideas because our male journalists, editors, and photographers are now fighting. And so I think there is no shortage of kind of democratic flavor of media in Ukraine. It's a shortage of actual people who can work in media because so many people were mobilized.
Follow up just briefly. So I was specifically interested in the development of independent journalism as a profession. It's quite remarkable how many
Interesting.
Ukrainians, for example, are reporting in international sources. You look at Wall Street Journal, the Times, the Post, there are always Ukrainians involved in reporting the news. So
Yeah,
in terms of training as professional journalists, that's really the interest here.
yeah, but I don't think it comes from the Ukrainian side. I think it's rather these media outlets, they're seeking for someone to give a comment. And many Ukrainian journalists or NGO members working as fixers. So that's how they get in touch with media outlets and either provide comments themselves or advise someone to give a comment, whether it will be translated in kind of new style of independent journalism. I don't think so. I actually think that well, it's more anecdotal. It's my own feeling after talking to my friends in media. I think they would rather what they really want. They want capacity. They want to go back to normal, to have like a big editorial team, a lot of journalists working under one roof together. They don't really. They think that individual journalism is more like they do it out of necessity, but they don't believe that this is the best way to develop.
All right, we did it.